I want to tell you about some amazing things that can happen when you're brave. Brave enough to listen to your instinct, brave enough to challenge the way that your organizations work, and brave enough to listen to your stakeholders. The British Communications, Education and Technology Agency, or BECTA, was set up by the UK government to bring technology into schools. When I met them last year, they were so hamstrung by bureaucracy and politics and pen pushing, they'd forgotten how to speak to the people they'd been set up to serve. And they knew they would become irrelevant if they didn't do something about it. So they pulled me in to ask me whether I could connect them with a network of content and tech companies and to reconnect them with educators. I suggested that we should launch a social media campaign that would lead to a technology-enabled event. Educators and industry would co-create a debate about the revolution that technology could cause in education. I argued that the buzz around the event would help to reposition BECTA, and I knew that if they listened to the conversations there, they'd start to understand their stakeholders better. And then it hit me, maybe if we were going to have a conversation about redesigning technology, it might make sense to have kids involved. So I suggested that maybe we should get schools across the UK to watch the stream and to tweet in live, and to workshop and tweet in live. So the challenge was set. We were going to break down the walls between 4 very different constituencies, each with their own very firmly ingrained prejudices and preconceptions. There was BECTA themselves, and they really wanted to change the way that people saw them, but they were terrified of change. There were the educators who were deeply not happy with BECTA, but passionate about education. There was the industry who were either not trusting BECTA or they didn't even know they existed, but they did want to get good content and tech into schools. And of course, the kids themselves, who were not used to being listened to at all. So, after jumping through over bars and squeezing through procurement hoops, as you do, we were off with a whole 12 weeks to go. We were going to design and deliver a co-created debate that was going to lead to an event for 100 delegates, hundreds of remote delegates, and kids in schools, in 15 schools across the UK. Actually, at the time I said this, I had no idea how we were going to do this or if it would work. But that's the first lesson in being brave. Sometimes you have to just listen to your instinct, you have to say yes, and then figure out how you're going to do it later. So we engaged industry and educators right from the very beginning, and we asked them what they thought we should talk about and who they thought we should invite into the debate. And we used these interviews. Each interview was turned into a blog. Each blog generated a few tweets. We took little vox pops of the interviews so we could put those on YouTube. We put photographs and tagged them up onto Flickr. And of course, we used a hashtag to be able to listen to what people started talking about. My job was to listen to what people were saying and to start to sculpt a story that was emotional enough to grab loads of other people to get them involved in the conversation. And actually, that bit was pretty easy. That's kind of what we do. And people were really interested in the idea that policymakers were actually going to bother to listen to what they were going to say. But then there was the schools. Now, that's a different story. When I first started the project, I went to see 3 educational consultants to ask them how I could make sure it worked for schools. And the answers they gave me, all 3 of them, very clearly and unanimously, is that it's not going to work, for 2 clear reasons. Firstly, the teachers are never going to let those kids take the time out to get involved. And secondly, the kids are not going to be able to concentrate for the 35-minute panels. They're going to be disruptive, they're going to get bored, and they're not going to be able to feed in meaningfully into that conversation. So I trusted my intuition, and I ignored them. So 12 weeks later, 30 interviews later, a few very nervous days and a few very sleepless nights, we were there. And 97 of the 100 delegates that were invited came along, and they stayed for the whole event. Hundreds of people watched the stream online and tweeted in. The excitement in there was palpable. And then there were the kids. We could never have predicted how fantastic the kids were going to be. It snowed on the day of the event, so it was really difficult for some of those kids to get into school, but they made it anyway. One of the schools, the weather in Scotland was so bad that they lost their broadband, but they were so keen to get there that they actually congregated at another school so they could join us. This is actually introducing the kids when they all arrived. So the schools I'm about to introduce you to are those schools. So let's start from... Do we have Perth Academy with us? Did Perth manage to make it? So some of the schools only managed, they said they could only stay for the first session, but the kids negotiated extra time. And not only did they stay for the whole school day, but they actually stayed late. And the ones that couldn't stay late went home and carried on getting involved from home. And the kids, they transformed the event. When the keynote stood up the front at the beginning of the event and said in a very kind of solid way, kids don't watch TV anymore, the kids disagreed with it, and they said it and they did it in a very loud way. And it happened all the way through the events. When us experts talked about what kids did, they told us that wasn't the case. And then at the end of the day, came the pièce de résistance. We'd set up a live link to one of the schools so that they could feed back live to workshopped ideas. The kids were watching, the guy was pitching his idea, and then one of the kids started scribbling. And then the guy finished his pitch, one of the kids started feeding back, and the scribbler carried on scribbling. Now, I assumed that he was bored, that he'd just lost it with it, he stopped concentrating. But then he lifted up his head and he said, I can see where you're going with this, but to be honest, I think there's a better way of doing it. And he lifted up a piece of paper, and on it, he'd drawn a wireframe, perfect wireframe. And this was a kid talking to a BBC Kids commissioner. And it worked on lots of levels. One school was so impressed with their group of kids that they kept them on as their technical advisors. One head teacher, after listening to the kids, took down the filters from their internet. A network was seeded that day that's now the most important UK knowledge transfer network for teachers. I think by having the chance to speak and be heard, everyone felt empowered. And did it change the way that BIMA was perceived? Absolutely yes. Everyone was gobsmacked that they'd commissioned such a risky, transparent project. And I even heard one of the people in the audience talking about BIMA as being cool. And believe me, that would have never happened before. So, if that model can happen between these four very disparate groups, why shouldn't it happen for other groups? I'm now curating an event at the ITU, which is the UN agency that's been set up to connect the world, to make sure the right frameworks are in place to connect the world. The event that I'm working on brings together the very highest level of policymaker with the highest level of telecommunications and tech agencies. Up till now, that event's been behind closed doors. It's been very much about men in suits and ties, talking to men in suits and ties, and I imagine there's probably been an awful lot of talking and not very much listening. But this year, we're doing something very different. A, we're streaming live, which is amazing. B, we're partnering up with telecentres, and they've got 200,000 offices across the world where people, no matter where they are, can get online. They're going to be accepting the stream, and they're going to be workshopping and feeding back in over Twitter. And we're also, and directly inspired by the BIMA experience, going to hold a global Meta Kids Conference, where schools and kids across the world will workshop around the stream, and they'll feed in their ideas and their thoughts and their ideas of how we can use technology to make the world a better place. And will it work? Well, I hope so. If we manage to create a dynamic, transparent environment where participants can drop their defenses, I think that the conversation can only be better. If we're part of a co-created conversation where everybody's opinion is valid, where everybody is a learner and everybody's a contributor, what I am convinced about is that all of those people, or some of those people, will say things that are worth hearing if they know that somebody out there can be bothered to listen. And what I'm also sure about is that none of these things are going to happen unless we're brave. Brave enough to listen to our instincts, brave enough to challenge the way that our organizations have worked, and brave enough to listen, and I mean really listen, to our stakeholders. Thanks for listening.